Hi everyone, and welcome to week 13's Geography 324 lecture on pandemics and transportation. So as we all know all too well these days, a pandemic is an extensive outbreak of an infectious disease. Pandemics are important not only because of their huge health impacts, but they're also important because they serve as a vivid reminder of how globally interconnected the world is now. And understanding pandemics through the lens of transportation, particularly by looking at the speed and connectivity of air travel, becomes a really important means of understanding the global spread of diseases. So we understand transportation primarily as a vector of the virus, okay? So how the virus itself moves around, particularly when we look at passenger transportation systems, and most notably in the case of this pandemic, especially through particular stages of pandemic that we'll be going over, we need to understand that global air transport hubs are a key way of understanding how pandemics diffuse, okay? So the diffusion of pandemics. Of course, transportation isn't the only way that pandemic diseases emerge and spread. It's a really complex mix of social, biological, environmental, and also political forces. Their heightened potential for spread is also linked to global flows of people and products, and this is primarily what we'll be looking at today. So this is sort of the angle that we'll be taking to understand pandemics today and their linkages with transportation. So our lecture today is going to explore the geographic dimensions of disease pandemics, particularly through the lens of transportation. So we're going to examine how and why pandemics occur, how they move from place to place, also their unequal impacts on people and places, and finally we're going to explore some of the potentially more positive impacts that the pandemic has in terms of urban transportation and on urban transportation systems. So this topic of the geography of transportation is admittedly new to me. I decided to do it a few weeks ago when COVID-19 and its impacts were really just starting to be realized. It's been an excellent learning experience for me. Thankfully, there were a ton of excellent resources out there in academia, and also some of these resources made their way into popular news articles that I was reading. But I just wanted to show you, this is a list of the resources that I leaned on pretty heavily for compiling this lecture and for choosing what aspects of the geography of transportation when it comes to pandemics were most important for you to know. So this lecture isn't necessarily a third year level of analysis, but I wanted to make sure that we were all familiar with the key terms involved with understanding the geographic dimensions of pandemics and disease spread, and also looking at beginning to think through the ways that the pandemic impacts urban transportation in particular. So here's a list of sources if you're interested in exploring more on your own. And I've also done my best to cite these sources throughout, especially image grabs and things like that. So you should be able to go and locate all of this on your own. So this first part of the lecture is going to look at how pandemics spread through transportation networks, and geographers categorize the spread through 4 distinct phases of pandemics. So we're going to go through each one of those. Now, traditionally and historically, pandemics spread out from an epicenter in sort of concentric circles, if you will. So because transportation is primarily in the past local and perhaps regional, It was pretty easy to trace. I wouldn't say easy. It's relatively straightforward to trace how disease spreads within communities, because it can really only spread as fast as, the quickest mode of transportation. And you can look at the direction of spread, basically between trade routes. So it's becoming, in our increasingly interconnected world, it was becoming a lot more difficult, in recent decades to understand the dynamics of global disease spread, from this approach. So two important, scholars that have come up with a new approach are Brockman and Helbing. And these are the scholars, that were also, mentioned in the City Lab article that you were to read. So their new approach for understanding global disease dynamics is based on this intuitive notion that in our really, closely connected world, conventional geographic distances are no longer a key variable. So it's not so much the distance, in kilometers or miles between two different nodes that matters as much as what they have, proposed as the term effective distance. So we'll be talking more about that later, in the lecture. But in a nutshell, effective distance, is different from conventional distances, and it really, seeks to, scale and trace the degree of interconnectedness between two different global nodes or transportation nodes. And it has very little to do with physical distance between point A and B. It looks more at, sort of the flow of passengers, the sort of frequency of the connections between those two nodes, among a few other things. So what were formerly complex dynamic patterns, with really, it didn't seem like there was any structure, by looking at effective distance, they're able to, capture these patterns mathematically. So this diagram shows a synthetic representation of how, an influenza pandemic, so not a coronavirus, but influenza, could spread through a global transportation network. So these graphics were modeled off of, a strain of influenza known as the Spanish flu, H1N1. And Spanish flu had an incubation phase of about 3 to 4 days, and it could easily be transmitted from human to human. So the risk is even higher if the incubation phase is longer and also asymptomatic. And this is, what's been revealed and what is known to be taking place with the COVID-19, so the coronavirus, novel coronavirus 2019. So while H1N1 had an incubation phase of 3 to 4 days, we know that the incubation phase for COVID-19 could last as long as 14 days before you show any symptoms. And also, it's been shown that many people can in fact carry the virus and be asymptomatic for that entire incubation period. So it could be spreading, without, those who are infected with the virus even knowing it. So the pandemic, stages here are divided into 4 distinct phases: emergence, translocation, diffusion, and finally pandemic. Another important factor here, and again, this is sort of a bit of armchair epidemiology for you, and I'm sure it's sort of as much information as you've gathered following, the news cycle. But an important thing, to understand here is the R factor. So the R factor basically, describes for every one person that becomes infected with the virus, how many people will that one person infect. So traditional influenza, it ranges anywhere from 0 to 1. For COVID-19, the R factor is estimated to be somewhere between 2 and 3, and the most common R factor I've seen in different news sources is 2.3. So that means that for every one person infected, they are likely to spread it to 2.3 people. Because of the complexity of worldwide mobility and the patterns of modern disease spread, it seems geographically chaotic. So understanding where it's going to pop up and how it's going to spread, because the world is so sort of complexly interconnected through transportation networks, it seems more difficult to model. And it should be no surprise to us that if we consider this complexity of the modern air transportation network, thinking that and knowing that there's over 4,000 airports worldwide, that the air transportation industry serves more than 3 billion passengers every year, and each day, averaged out between all the people making these travels, more than 10 billion kilometers are traveled each day in this system. We can sort of begin to see the complex nature faced by academics and experts who have to come up with the models to understand how and where and why particular diseases spread. So this is a robust field of scholarship that's existed for decades that we're really just going to start to dip our toes into today. Okay, so let's start at the beginning. At the beginning of a pandemic, we have emergence. So emergence concerns the area where the contagion first emerges and the epidemiology involved before the virus is known by public authorities. So the location and connectivity of the emergence area is very important. There are several ecological regions where new strains of influenza can emerge. And in the current transportation economic context, the emergence of COVID-19 in China brings about a whole different array of risks. So first of all, it's one of the largest manufacturing centers in the world, especially around the Pearl River Delta. So what this means is that there's intense trade and business transactions and significant migrations of people from different regions of China, and also networks of people living in different countries that have connections with these industrial areas. Additionally, there's also a large international transportation terminal network. This includes the largest airports in the world, and they're all within close proximity to where this virus is thought to have emerged. So if the virus jumps right away to one of these gateways, diffusion, which is the next stage, is going to be rapid and extensive. And this is all even before it's being acknowledged as a significant health threat. So because the incubation period is so long, up to 14 days of not showing any symptoms, the proximity of where this virus first emerged to these sort of global transportation hubs means that COVID-19 became rapidly a significant health threat before public health authorities and experts were really, even aware of its existence. So after emergence, we have the second phase, which is translocation. So since incubation times for different types of viruses vary, that means that there could be ample time for someone who is infected to travel, perhaps to the other side of the world, before even noticing symptoms. So this translocation phase is perhaps most crucial in a pandemic. So when symptoms have developed, there's a risk that there's this denial phase where someone who's infected will continue traveling, particularly if they're going back to their place of origin. So because, of our, schedules and also cancellation fees and also sort of the expense of airline travel, if one person is sick, it's going to take a lot for them to sort of miss that flight or skip that flight if they're not feeling great, especially if they're sort of in the early stages of being symptomatic. So an infected individual who's just beginning to show these symptoms is not very likely to cancel any kind of outbound travel. And some even break quarantine warnings in order to get back wherever home is. So this means that in the window of a few days before an outbreak is apparent, the virus easily translocates to many different locations around the world. And at this point, the vector and also the velocity of modern transportation systems ensures that an epidemic becomes a pandemic. So it's really this global interconnected transportation system that is so robust that brings us, a lot of the modern conveniences and technologies that we've come to rely upon in public life and in present times. It's also that very system that makes the risks and also the consequences of outbreak as it transitions to epidemic, and then as it transitions to pandemic, it also makes those risks much higher. So how can pandemic geographers model translocation? We're going to learn more about this in a few slides. It has to do with something called effective distance. But this is just one example of the models that were created to try and understand how the disease would be transported. So taking Wuhan Airport, that very first node at the bottom of this graphic, we see the levels of connectivity between other different hubs, airport hubs, and the size of that airport hub, so that is showing sort of the amount of traffic and passengers that pass through it daily, is indicated by the size of the circle. So we can see those closest effectively are the airports between which there's the highest levels of connectivity. And we can see how the disease translocates from that central node through the linkages with the other airports globally. So the third phase of pandemic we have is diffusion. So our global air transportation system is composed of different airports, over 4,000 all over the world, that have different volumes and levels of connectivity. And this implies that depending on the airport, there's going to be a potentially different scale of scope and diffusion. So again, depending on how connected the closest airport is, you're going to have a different scope of diffusion. So this issue is most concerning for the early phases of a pandemic, so usually the first 10 to 14 days. And this is when transportation systems are most likely to spread a local or regional outbreak to the global level. So diffusion happens after translocation. So translocation has brought the infection of the virus to major transport hubs all over the world. And from these multiple hubs, this phase of diffusion means that the pandemic diffuses in a more standard fashion. And this is linked to proximity and slower land transport systems, such as railroad and public transit. But diffusion really is often referred to as community spread. So this is, you might have heard of community cases. So this is, after the virus jumps from different hubs in the world, the diffusion phase is where it's spread within a community. So from a pandemic control standpoint, it's almost too late to do anything that's going to have an extensive impact. For instance, slowing down air traffic, having more control, or screening of people who are traveling from different parts of the world. Now it's time to put emergency measures into action. So this is when we had social distancing measures and community closures and shutdowns to try and slow the rate of diffusion. And the main goal of these measures are, of course, to slow that spread so that the medical systems don't become overwhelmed, and also so that supply chains can continue to operate. And we're going to talk about supply chains a little bit later on in the lecture. So diffusion is more difficult to model. The geographers doing the modeling are able to model translocation really well, but diffusion becomes more difficult to model. Because once communities spread, or the stage of diffusion begins, there are wide inequalities in people's exposure to pathogens. And there are differing abilities to cope and also resist the disease, to avoid coming into contact with the virus. And also there's a lot of inequality in terms of their access to effective treatments. So this concept of vulnerability is really crucial for understanding inequalities in our transportation system. And for those using sort of public or community level transportation systems. And vulnerability is also strongly associated with social and institutional networks, and the types of supports that are able to be there for people, and what contribute to their coping capacities during these times. Vulnerability to viruses and disease is also rooted in a lack of power, and also social isolation and marginalization. And these are processes that can cut people off from the support that they need, and also limit their abilities to respond or adapt to the types of emergency measures put in place. So previous research has shown that taking public transit increases a person's risk for catching respiratory infections, such as the flu or the common cold. Generally, buses and trains aren't very well ventilated. You're coming in close contact with a variety of people. In urban settings, again, we have this idea of translocation. So urban settings are also places where people gather that have, traveled extensively to other parts of the world. And the same can be said for this novel case of coronavirus. Vulnerability to this virus is strongly related to the frequency with which people are in these spaces, and depending on an individual's vulnerability. So, the vulnerabilities for COVID-19 are generally associated with age and also underlying medical conditions. But there's all sorts of other types of vulnerabilities that are at play once the community spread begins to take place. So, for instance, substandard and crowded housing, not being able, depending on one's situation, to be able to practice social distancing or physical distancing. Poor sanitation also brings people into contact with pathogens a lot. So, we can understand how inequality and bringing in an intersectional lens to who transports the disease, and also how diffusion takes place. There's a whole slew of social and political and economic factors that are at play here beyond the epidemiological factors of COVID-19. So one quick example to show you how inequalities play into the diffusion or community spread of pandemic, in particular in urban settings and urban transportation settings. I drew from some data that the New York Times reported. So the New York City Transit Authority was able to show that ridership took a plunge over the last several weeks, but that decrease in ridership was not as significant in poorer neighborhoods. So we see the necessity of public transportation in these neighborhoods, getting to more central spaces of the city. We also see the types of jobs that those traveling from those neighborhoods usually have. These are generally low-wage jobs, but now we see sort of a reframing of these low-wage, formerly, deemed low-skilled jobs are now being framed as essential services. So on the subways in New York City, the CEO of that transit authority reported that they're serving about 13% of pre-pandemic levels, so only 13% of ridership has been retained through the pandemic, but they're maintaining 75% of their service. And something that's really troubling that has been shown, that has been denied by Foy, who is the CEO of the New York City Metro Transit Authority. He's denying sort of this idea that there's been overcrowding in subways, but a quick Google search will show you plenty of video clips and footage over the last few weeks of essential services workers cramming into overcrowded subway systems. And we know that it's impossible to practice social distancing or keeping that safe proximity around you from others who may be carrying the virus and perhaps they don't know. And the people that have increased levels of exposure are the ones that have to take public transportation. And we can see again that there are a whole range of social, economic, and political reasons why people have to keep taking public transportation during this time. And we can see how this is linked to level of exposure and higher susceptibilities to contracting the virus. So now we're at the fourth stage of pandemic. So once diffusion has happened in multiple global transportation hubs around the world, at this point, pandemic is a reality, and there are really just a few locations that remain unaffected. They remain unaffected either by chance or isolation or maybe robust early containment measures. But it becomes then a shift in public health policy, not just to mitigate the pandemic, but also to provide medical relief. And also to do our best to maintain essential supply chains, particularly food and medical supplies. So passenger transportation, we know now, has slowed down to a trickle. The last time there was a global disruption to air transportation was when a volcano erupted in Iceland in 2010. And even then, this only really affected Europe. This is a global disruption, and we know that air transportation has essentially halted for passengers, and it's really difficult to assess, what the long-term and also short-term impacts of this are going to be. It could just be a slowdown where, data coming in, and also I'll talk to you about this later when we talk about supply chains, is showing that, all could be well. It could be a dip in supply chains. But also if the virus isn't managed properly with social distancing and shutdowns and really trying to, flatten that curve, it could be more catastrophic, and we could see, shortages of food and other types of medical supplies if it isn't dealt with quickly and efficiently. So this is interesting now, looking at pandemics now, because for most of human history, populations are relatively small and isolated. Infectious diseases are spread locally. And, we didn't really have to worry too much or be concerned too much with this translocation phase. And it's really the translocation phase that makes a pandemic of particular viruses almost a guarantee. So pandemics before couldn't really emerge because people couldn't travel fast or far enough to lead to this global spread. And over the past several centuries, because of our rapidly expanding global flow of people and goods and transportation interconnectedness and networks, really have, as I already mentioned, put us at greater potential for pandemic spread. So this is sort of the uniqueness of the interconnectedness of our system, sort of all but guarantees that when novel viruses such as COVID-19 emerge, it's all but guaranteed that it's going to reach this pandemic level. So there's a really great article in Forbes that was essentially a photo essay of aerial shots of major airports all over the world with just lines and lines of parked airplanes. So here we have Charles de Gaulle in Paris, and we see just lines of airplanes that are not flying anywhere. And this is just a really interesting moment of time when we have really a near shutdown of air passenger transportation. The lower photo in this slide shows Vancouver's port. And while much of the country is slowing down, being distant, Canada's largest port is almost as busy as it was this time last year. There's been a reported 15% decrease in activity between January and now. And this is mostly due to a drop in imports from China, but also exports from Canada to Asia, particularly the demand for canola oil has dropped. But really, Vancouver's Port Authority is reporting that it's really business as usual, of course with a lot of social distancing protocols in place for employees and a lot of extra disinfecting. 6,500 workers are still reporting for duty at Vancouver's port to load and unload cargo from ships. Also, tradespeople like mechanics and millwrights and welders are showing up to Vancouver's port. And we see here that, because Vancouver's port is the largest port in Canada, it's a critical piece of sort of the supply chain puzzle. So last month, February, there was about 65,000 containers that came into the port and 51,000 were shipped out. This represents a 50% decrease, as I said, from the same month last year. So yes, things have slowed, but not all that significantly. And it should be mentioned that last year, also due to sort of a bit of a slowdown in global imports and exports, the port experienced about that much decrease last year as well. So even, pandemic aside, just global economic conditions for trade can lead to this amount of a slowdown in supply chain. So the biggest shift for the Vancouver Port Authority happened in January and February. So this was when all manufacturing, not all, but most major manufacturing and industry was shut down in Asia, in China. So at that point in January, international freight and logistics companies were reporting declines as much as 85%. So really the hardest hit time was during January and February. Canadian monthly imports from China fell 12.1% in that month alone. That was mostly interesting because there were fewer cell phone deliveries, so fewer shipments of cell phones coming in. But things have been, picking up, and it's looking, cautiously optimistic that, in particular, our supply chains are, maintaining themselves and remaining attainable. And there's a lot of, essential work going on to load and unload that cargo to ensure that food and medical supplies and other important things are still being moved around the world through these transportation networks. So now that we've gone over these 4 distinct phases of how viruses and diseases are transported through the world through transportation networks, we're going to turn to a very, before all of this was happening, a very sort of out there or distant or fringe area of geography. But now it's really coming to the forefront, and the leaders of that field, including Brockman and Helbing, and others that I listed on the second slide of resources. These pandemic geographers are really instructive to those of us in the field of geography to try and understand how these things move around and how can we predict and use predictive modeling to understand where a virus is going to go and how it moves through transportation networks specifically. So an epidemic, as we know, is a sudden disease outbreak, but it's affects a large number of people, so larger than what's normally expected. But an epidemic means that it's usually basically confined to a particular region or community or population. And an epidemic shifts to pandemic level when it spreads to a larger region or across multiple nations or continents. So pandemic geographers are really looking through a global lens, through global transportation networks, to understand how that epidemic, so that regionally confined outbreak, moves and gets to this pandemic level, moves throughout the whole globe. So we should start with the basics. How did disease and viruses transport themselves through history? So in the 14th century, we have the bubonic plague, and this is a map with timelines of how that disease spread throughout the continent of Europe. Although this event, the bubonic plague, was driven by the interplay of human interactions and also mobility on pretty large geographic scales for that time, we can see that how it moves really follows a kind of simple structure. So there's an initial outbreak in southern Europe, and then we have these sort of wave fronts, large-scale wave fronts. So thinking about, waves moving in a particular direction, further and further away from the place where the outbreak or the emergence first occurred. And we see it's moving relatively slowly now, but pretty constant. It moves, a spread of a few kilometers per year across the entire continent. So this pandemic at the time, took place on a much longer time scale than what we're experiencing today. Because again, because it's transmitted human to human and through, face-to-face contact, it can really only travel geographically through space as fast as one can walk. So we see a much longer time scale for this pandemic, and these waves, indicated by the red lines, are indicating years. And now when we compare this to today, things change rapidly, day to day, hour to hour. Knowing that you can fly from one side of the world to the other in 18 to 20 hours, depending on your level of connections and stops you have to make, we see that the disease diffusion and translocation happens on a much more compressed time scale. So now we have this key term brought to us by pandemic geographers of effective distance. So effective distance is based on the idea that places that are connected by large amounts of traffic should be considered to be effectively closer on a plausible map layout than places with little traffic. So here, instead of looking at, the amount of kilometers or miles between point A and B, The higher levels of connectivity, so the larger amounts of traffic between A and B, should really be the number one factor in understanding the effective distance between two places. So this concept was first introduced in 2013 by pandemic geographers in an issue of Science, which is one of, no, pretty sure it's the top academic journal globally. So we can use this method, well, not me, but pandemic geographers can use this method to compute a location's perspective on the world and effective distance, and effectively the shortest paths to all other locations. So these paths are often dominated by the most likely spreading paths of pandemics, and we can quantify the relative import risk, we'll talk about import risk in just a second, of sort of the infectious viruses or diseases. So this is really recalibrating how we think of space and distance. And it no longer, when we're talking about pandemics and disease spread, how physically distant point A and B are from one another is not as much of a factor in understanding the spread of infectious diseases as the level of connectivity between points A and B. So the effective distance between two locations or multiple locations is a much more telling and actionable in terms of creating a model of understanding how a virus or disease spreads globally. So even though two places might be really far apart, if there's a lot of frequent transportation between those two places, especially in terms of the amount of traffic, so the number of people and the frequency of flights that occur between A and B, that effective distance is actually quite close. So I want you to try and split this graphic up. This is again from Brockman, between the top half and the bottom half. So the top half, we have sort of different stages of spread. Looking at, usually that translocation is really what this map is trying to show. And while we can make some inferences about where it's going to go. So generally, the red dots are urban areas. We know increasingly that we live on an urban planet, so there's more people living in cities now than there is not. So it looks like it's concentrated around cities, but there isn't maybe a lot of rhyme or reason as to why it's starting clustering around particular types of cities. So it's a lot more chaotic to try and figure out and see a pattern emerging. And the lower half, instead of having the traditional map, this is a map that shows effective distances between different nodes of the global transportation network. So depending on what that central hub is, and again, the pandemic geographers can do this model for most major air transport hubs in the world. And then moving out from that is the effective distance. So not the physical distance, but the effective distance between different places. And we can see that, on the left, we have sort of the early stages, perhaps like the beginning of translocation. And we can see each different circle or spoke on that graphic is a different transportation node. The more connected, so the shorter the effective distance, closer the effective distance, I should say, to the place of emergence, that's where it's going to go first. And then the virus will spread in subsequent stages over time to those that are effectively more distant from that central emergence point. So this makes a lot more sense, and we can really see a pattern starting to emerge when we recalibrate how we think of space in this way as opposed to a traditional map. So now that we know that effective distance has been shown to be a much better predictor of expected arrival time of an epidemic than traditional geodesic distances, we can use that information to inform and try and calculate the relative import risk. So the relative import risk is another key term here. Air passenger numbers allow us to estimate how likely it is that a virus spreads to other areas. So the busier a flight route, the shorter the affected distance, the higher the relative import risk of that pandemic. So we can use sort of all these factors and understanding the level of connectivity. So higher levels of connectivity equals a shorter effective distance, equals heightened levels of relative import risk. So the diagram here is a nice display of that. The more people traveling between 2 points, the higher the level of import risk of importing that virus or disease to other transportation nodes. So likely because this pandemic is global in its spread and reach, we focused a lot on the global aspects of how transportation networks impact or lead to pandemics. But I want to do a bit of a pivot here to focus on the impacts of urban transportation, because urban transportation has been really the key focus of this course so far. It's worth considering the different kinds of positive impacts this has had on our urban transportation systems. This pandemic has offered us a very unique, perhaps even once in a lifetime opportunity to reimagine the transportation system in urban space and to push it towards more resilient, equitable, and seamless experience for those who are using it. So our transportation system was already in transition. We've been reading about how we're trying to move from privately owned automobiles for a single commuter powered by fossil fuels and get people using different types of modes. So whether that's on demand or shared or electric or fully automated or public systems. This shift was already underway in Vancouver. But now we see, with the social distancing measures in place and other protocols for the pandemic, we see a lot of sort of the negative aspects being removed, especially when we're thinking about congestion and pollution, when we're talking about street space being freed up, and also sort of unique ways of sharing different types of services, combining trips or, doing grocery runs for those who are perhaps more vulnerable or susceptible, and just heightened levels of cooperation. So the first graphic on the top left is sort of this classic graphic that shows how, who has the different amounts of privilege and access to urban space when it comes to transportation. So we see the privately owned automobile on the right with a single occupant taking up, a huge portion of street space. And that's juxtaposed on the left with those who are using public forms of transportation. And we see that they're really crammed in, whether it's a cyclist with really narrow bike lanes or people crammed into the bus or waiting for the bus. And we see how this allocation of space is really a privileging of certain types of transport. And we can compare this to the image just right next to it on the right. This is taken from Calgary. Vancouver's considering this right now. Calgary has implemented it, but really shutting down lanes of roads to allow for the public to walk. A lot of the pathways that people were frequenting when they were trying to get outside did not allow for proper social distancing. So it was proposed and implemented that street space be allocated to pedestrians to allow for people to be outside and still have, proper distancing between one another. So this is something that When we think about Sadiq Khan's street designs and when we think about car-free spaces such as Robson Square, this is something that urban transportation enthusiasts and urbanists have been really fighting for a number of years. In terms of who has access to space and under what conditions. We can also think about when we learned from Michael Onimus about the rapid bus line, having bus-only lanes. This is another sort of iteration of how people who live in urban spaces can sort of reclaim that right to particular aspects of the city for themselves and not just for those who are in private automobiles. So it's really important to have great public spaces at a time like this. I'm sure, well, I really hope that a lot of you have, enjoyed the sunny days and been able to get outside and enjoy the city at a safe distance from others. But in order to really do this, we need more space and we need more options. And closing streets to cars and opening them for people is one way that this has started to emerge. And we can hope that this, could be a lasting thing for cities to keep car-free streets and making more space for people and not for cars. So that's one example of something positive coming out of the tragedy of this pandemic. It really has transformed maybe not necessarily the way we travel, but also the frequency of our travel. A lot of companies are realizing, and this isn't the same depending on the sector, but a lot of people have realized that maybe it's not totally necessary for people to make that commute to work, to the office every single day. Perhaps productivity levels and different types of tasks can be done at home. So this could have an impact, a lasting impact on the amount of people that commute during those peak times. The positive side of this is that it's cleaning up our air. I'm sure you've seen the footage over different cities. I saw some great photographs of LA yesterday, and just the smog has totally cleared. So even though this pandemic has a lot of negatives in terms of public health, it also has some positive impacts with the amount of pollution and smog and, impact on climate. So this is really an opportunity that we can take to think about, how has this massive disruption given us new ideas and new ways of thinking about what's possible. Some other things that have happened in Vancouver is, every buses have no fares. A lot of people and activists have been pushing for fare-free transit. I talked about this, touched on this in the lecture that you listened to last week. Also, rear door loading. I know that a lot of you are really passionate about that rear door loading scenario. This is the only way that people can get on buses right now in Vancouver in order to maintain safe distance between drivers and passengers. But this is something that perhaps we can see implemented, and that really makes commuting more efficient when you have that all door boarding and loading. There's also been a huge increase, going to the final picture at the bottom there, on active transportation. So obviously this is not available to everybody. You need to have the means to purchase a bicycle. You need to have the ability to ride a bicycle. But New York City, since social distancing measures were introduced, has seen a 52% increase in cyclists. And I know anecdotally, a lot of people in Vancouver, a lot of people are more likely to cycle now because it's safer. There's not as many cars on the road. So people are more likely, beyond sort of that typical cyclist, which is usually a man and usually, in their 20s to 40s. It's brought in a whole bunch of new people who previously did not feel safe cycling or were not able to for other types of reasons. And now because people are perhaps avoiding being on more congested public transit, and also they have lots of time and lots of things that they need to fill their time with, perhaps if they are not working as much or working from home or need a break, is to get out on a bike. And I think that this could potentially lead to, a greater push beyond sort of the hub, which is HEB, which is Vancouver's sort of pro-cycling policy activist group. People sort of demanding more space for bicycles in Vancouver, maybe slower speed limits. This is another huge factor for people wanting to cycle safely through cities. So yeah, this is just a few examples of the areas where we might see some positive impacts of this pandemic on urban transportation. So I think we now know more than ever, especially in that we don't have access to them as much, is that our way of life is really based on physical interactions and social interactions. As humans, it's how we're built, it's how we function and thrive, and in cities, these types of, close encounters with others is really what sort of makes cities vibrant, diverse spaces. And especially now that over half of the world's population live in cities, it's also a place where we find a lot of opportunities to create ideas, to exchange knowledge, and again, to interact with and come together with people who are different from ourselves. So even though cities have been, the epicenter of this pandemic, and it's been cities and urban areas have been, places where the pandemic has diffused, I mean, we also need to, remind ourselves that cities are also places where a lot of hope can come from. They are sort of centers for, thinking and diversity, and places where, change can really sort of come out of cities. So hopefully one of the positive impacts will be coming out of urban areas, as well as we sort of readjust to life as this pandemic slows and eventually passes. And I'd love to hear you discuss in your tutorials different ways that you have seen or thought about the COVID-19 pandemic impacting urban transportation for the better, and what sort of ideas you have about moving forward, different ways that we can take, the lessons learned from this unique and challenging period of time and implement them to our urban transportation systems in order to make them better and improve them. All right, thanks a lot for listening. I hope you learned something. I definitely learned a lot preparing this for you. And enjoy your discussions, and I will see you next week on Zoom for our final meeting.